So Marquis rejects this idea that we find in Thompson that right to privacy and right to life are both rights that have a claim and must be balanced against each other when they come into conflict as a means of discussing and determining the moral permissibility of abortion in various types of circumstances. And so he concludes that the moral permissibility or impermissibility of abortion depends upon whether or not we can establish that fetuses have a right to life. He considers two sorts of arguments for why fetuses might or might not have a right to life. On the one hand, people might argue that fetuses are genetic members of the human race, but he suggests that this argument is too weak, that things that have the same genetic features of human beings aren't considered to have rights, like cancer cells. We could add to this by noting that most animals are very genetically similar to human beings, and that this very small difference in the genome doesn't seem like some compelling reason. And so it looks like these sorts of rationales for why it is that human beings have an intrinsic right to life or why they should be considered as ends in themselves just don't provide sufficient justification either to suggest that human beings have a right to life or to differentiate human beings from other creatures that we don't suppose have an intrinsic right to life or that we don't think we need to treat as ends in and of themselves. He then turns his attention to arguments that would try to support a claim to right to life for human beings on the basis of the sorts of properties that we see Kant using to talk about why it is that human beings have to be considered as ends in themselves. So arguments that say, look, human beings have an intrinsic right to life because they are persons. They are creatures that are ends in and of themselves. They are rational creatures that determine their actions through reason. They have a qualitative experience, conscious experience. They communicate their ideas. They have a sense of themselves as continuing entities. Properties like these are properties that seem to differentiate human beings from other animals, and that seem to provide some justification for supposing that human beings need to be treated as intrinsically valuable, as ends in themselves, as things that have a right to life. But Marquis rejects this line of argumentation because he says this line of argumentation supposes that in order to have a right to life, you have to actually currently manifest these sorts of properties. You have to actually currently be a rational agent. You have to actually currently be conscious. You have to actually currently have a sense of yourself as a continuing individual. And he says that some of the creatures or entities that we want to accord a right to life aren't entities that always or currently exhibit those kinds of properties. And so he notes that infants don't do a lot of complex abstract reasoning. Before they learn to talk, they don't communicate complex ideas. They may have qualitative experiences, but it's not at all clear that they have a continuing sense of themselves as a continuing entity. And it's not clear that they possess any of these things to a greater degree than, say, for instance, pigs or crows, which actually turn out to be quite smart creatures. He also points to people who are severely mentally handicapped and to people who have severe mental illnesses as other examples of individuals who might not be manifesting this. And of course, people who are unconscious don't manifest these properties while they're unconscious also. And so for these reasons, he argues that these kinds of arguments based on properties that are actually manifested by actual people, that can't be the argument for the basis of a right to life. So what is Marquis's argument then? Well, his theory actually is kind of nicely expressed by the character Bill Money in the Clint Eastwood movie Unforgiven. At one point, Money says, "Hell of a thing killing a man. Take away all he's got and all he's ever going to have." And so this is the essential intuition that Marquis wants to use to argue as the basis for the right to life. And so he wants to suggest that the misfortune of premature death, right, the potential wrong done to an individual when they die prematurely, consists in the loss of the future goods of consciousness. So it's not that they're currently being rational. It's not that they're currently conscious and experiencing qualitative experiences like happiness or um, love. It's not that they currently have a sense of themselves as a continuing entity. It's not that they're currently communicating complex ideas and so on. It's that they have a potential to have these future goods of consciousness, to have these experiences, to manifest these properties. And so sometimes he calls these the future goods of consciousness. Sometimes he calls them a future like ours. Sometimes he calls them a valuable future or a future that's valued. And it's all somewhat ill-defined and nebulous, but the idea essentially is that we recognize certain properties, certain features of human conscious experience as intrinsically valuable, as the sort of things that make human beings persons as ends in themselves, as things that have an intrinsic right to life, and it is depriving human beings of the potential future experiences of this kind that we locate the harm of premature death. And so depriving people of a future like ours, future where they have conscious experiences that are relevantly similar to ours, is the basis, he thinks, of a right to life, because to deprive them of that future is to do them harm, and that, he argues, is a misfortune that constitutes a morally blameworthy action. So as we'll see, Marquis is going to present four arguments to further bolster the plausibility of his flow approach to arguing for why it is that human beings have a right to life, and also he'll argue that it extends to fetuses, and as a result, it makes a clear-cut argument that abortion is in fact morally wrong. And the first argument that he'll present to us is an argument that flow both predicts and explains our judgments about why death is a misfortune. The second argument that he makes is that flow explains why it is that murder is one of the worst crimes that one can commit, one of the most egregious moral offenses. The third argument he wants to make is that flow provides us with a means by which to understand and explain the intuitive differences that we carve out between various medical situations, like being in a permanent coma, or having a disease that causes you to experience intractable pain, or just being sedated, and so on. And the rights and responsibilities that we have towards those individuals, he thinks there are strong univocal intuitions about those cases, and that flow explains how we come to have those intuitions and why we differentiate the cases as we do. And finally, he wants to argue that flow helps us to explain why it is that we think that it's morally impermissible to unnecessarily cause suffering in animals. And the idea here is that while animals aren't capable of having a future like ours, they are capable of having some aspects of the goods of consciousness. And specifically, one of the goods that they're capable of experiencing is pleasure or an absence of pain. And hence we can understand why it's morally impermissible and morally wrong to cause animals suffering unnecessarily, because we are depriving them of something that's on analogy with a future like ours. We're depriving them of an intrinsic good or inflicting upon them the misfortune of not experiencing that good, or worse, suffering an intrinsic evil.